The air in the cabin of Blake's truck grew thin, pressed by the ascent. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the worn leather, his gaze fixed on the winding asphalt that snaked through the mountain pass. Pines, dark and ancient, clawed at the slate-gray sky, their needles thick with the scent of damp earth and something vaguely mineral. Each turn of the road offered only more of the same: towering rock faces, a precipitous drop veiled by mist, and the relentless low growl of the engine straining against the incline. Blake had driven for 2 days, leaving the city behind, its frantic pulse a distant, irritating hum. The landscape here, however, offered no solace, only a stark, uncompromising silence that amplified the ringing in his ears. It had been 6 months since the accident, since the world had fractured, leaving him with an absence that felt like a physical cavity in his chest. He was a cartographer, accustomed to mapping the known, but his personal terrain had become an uncharted wilderness of grief. This inheritance, Blackwood Manor, was meant to be a new coordinate, a place to redraw the lines of his existence, or at least to find a quiet corner where the echoes of his past might finally fade. Here, the pines gave way to gnarled oaks, their branches skeletal against the encroaching twilight. The GPS signal had vanished miles ago, replaced by a blank screen. But the solicitor's instructions, scrawled on a yellowed note, guided him. Follow the old logging track past the stone markers. He found the track, little more than a pair of muddy ruts disappearing into a dense thicket. Blake hesitated, the truck's tires spinning briefly in the muck before finding purchase. The track was overgrown, branches scraping against the vehicle's sides, the sound like skeletal fingers dragging across a blackboard. The light, already dim, seemed to drain away completely as he drove deeper, the trees forming a tunnel overhead. Then, through a sudden break in the canopy, it appeared. Blackwood Manor. The windows, countless and vacant, stared out like the eyes of a blind titan. Turrets, capped with crumbling slate, pierced the horizon, and a single, impossibly tall chimney rose from its center, a stark finger pointing towards the heavens. Decay was etched into every line. Sagging roof lines, moss-slicked walls, a front porch that seemed to list precariously. It was larger than he had anticipated, vast and utterly desolate. Blake parked the truck in front of a rusted iron gate, its hinges groaning in protest as he pushed it open. He climbed the wide, cracked stone steps. The double oak doors, heavy and scarred, yielded with a mournful sigh, revealing an interior swallowed by gloom. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the scent of dust, damp wood, and a peculiar cloying sweetness, like forgotten potpourri mixed with something else, something subtly organic and unpleasant. A sweeping staircase, its banister intricately carved but coated in a thick layer of grime, dominated the space. Cobwebs hung like tattered shrouds from the chandelier overhead. Blake's breath plumed in the frigid air. He moved deeper, his footsteps echoing ominously on the polished, albeit scuffed marble floor. His fingers brushed against a framed photograph hanging askew. He angled his flashlight. It was a family portrait, old and faded to sepia tones. A stern-faced man, a prim woman, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. But as his beam settled on the boy's face, a flicker of unease rippled through him. The boy's features were oddly indistinct, blurred, as if the light had leached the detail from his image alone, leaving a strangely blank space where his eyes should have been. It wasn't the natural fading of an old photograph. The other faces, though aged, retained their clarity. This particular boy's visage was a smudge, an erasure. Blake leaned closer, a prickle of gooseflesh rising on his arms. He could almost convince himself it was just a trick of the light, an anomaly of the print, but the impression of deliberate absence lingered. He continued his exploration, moving from the foyer into a vast drawing room. Velvet drapes, heavy with dust, blocked out the last vestiges of daylight. Furniture, draped in white sheets, stood like silent, ghostly sentinels. He pulled back a sheet from a grand piano. Its keys, yellowed and chipped, were still arranged in an orderly row. But when he pressed one, no sound emerged. The mechanism was utterly dead, the felt hammers stiff and silent. The instrument offered no protest, no creak, no mournful note. It was simply inert. A profound sense of wrongness settled over Blake. It was not the wrongness of decay, but of something deeper, something unnatural. The house did not merely feel old and abandoned. It felt empty in a way that defied explanation, as if it had been meticulously stripped of its essence, not just its inhabitants. The silence was not peaceful. It was watchful. Blake, the cartographer seeking new coordinates, suddenly felt profoundly, terrifyingly lost. Os the metal, a sound that made Blake's teeth ache. The truck lurched, then climbed, the gradient steepening as the track, barely visible now, began to ascend a narrow mountain pass. On one side, a sheer rock face scraped the passenger window. On the other, a perilous drop disappeared into a shroud of mist. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the engine groaning in protest. He could feel the altitude in his ears, a dull pressure that mirrored the tension in his chest. Finally, the track leveled, emerging into a small, desolate clearing. Before him stood the manor. It was worse than the photograph suggested. 3 stories of weathered stone and decaying timber, it sagged under the weight of time and neglect. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from under heavy brows of overgrown ivy, many of them shattered or boarded. A skeletal porch, its railings long rotted, leaned precariously. No smoke rose from any chimney, no light flickered within. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the engine's dying shudder as he cut the ignition. Blake sat for a long moment, the determination he'd clung to feeling suddenly brittle. This wasn't just an old house. It was a mausoleum. He pushed open the truck door, the sound a harsh crack in the stillness. The air was frigid, biting at his exposed skin. He grabbed his duffel bag and a small toolbox, the weight grounding him. The front door, a heavy slab of oak scarred by generations of weather, groaned as he forced it open. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a grand, albeit crumbling foyer. A sweeping staircase, its banister splintered, spiraled upwards into the blackness. Tapestries, once vibrant, now hung in tattered strips, resembling forgotten skin. He moved methodically, his boots echoing on the grimy flagstones. Dust motes danced in the flashlight's beam, a silent, perpetual snowfall. He paused, head tilted. The house was silent again. He dismissed it as the wind, perhaps whistling through a broken pane upstairs, or merely the creaks of an ancient structure settling. His exhaustion was a heavy cloak, making him prone to imagining things. He began his survey. The kitchen was a wreck, its iron stove rusted solid, its pantry shelves bare. In the dining room, a long, polished mahogany table was draped in a thick shroud of dust. He ran a hand over it, leaving a clean swipe. On a small, forgotten side table, he noticed a tarnished silver locket. He remembered seeing it in the lawyer's inventory, listed as miscellaneous personal effect. He was certain the inventory had described it as being in the master bedroom upstairs. Now here it was, nestled amongst a stack of brittle, unread letters. He picked it up. A small, irrational shiver traced its way down his spine. He told himself he must have misremembered the inventory. The house was a mess. Things would be out of place. He continued his exploration, moving with a cartographer's precision, mentally mapping the decay. In what he presumed was the library, rows of mildewed books stood sentinel on towering shelves. He pulled one out at random, a leather-bound volume on local flora. He spun, his flashlight beam sweeping the space. Nothing. Just the silent, dust-laden shelves. The incident brought a sudden, sharp ache to his chest, the sheer, crushing weight of it. He wouldn't allow his grief to manifest as spectral illusions. Blake found a small, cluttered study on the second floor, overlooking the overgrown garden. On a heavy oak desk, beneath a layer of dust so thick it muffled the grain, lay an old, rolled-up parchment. His cartographer's instinct drew him in. He carefully unrolled it. It was a hand-drawn map, dated almost 2 centuries prior, depicting the valley and the surrounding hills, rendered in meticulous detail. His own profession. He traced the lines with a finger. The manor was clearly marked, as were several long-vanished homesteads. But what caught his eye was a small, almost imperceptible symbol, crudely sketched in the furthest, most inaccessible corner of the map, deep within the mountains. It looked like a series of concentric circles, almost like ripples, emanating from a central, undefined point. A faint, almost imperceptible pressure seemed to build behind his eyes as he stared at it. It wasn't a geological marker, nor a surveyor's annotation. The lines were too organic, too deliberate. The symbol pulsed with a silent, unsettling significance. A sudden, sharp rap echoed from downstairs, like a fist striking wood. Blake froze, his breath catching in his throat. The house was utterly isolated. There was no one else here. The rationalizations were beginning to fray. The truck's engine strained, a low growl that vibrated through the worn seat. Blake gripped the armrest, his knuckles white. The ascent along the narrow mountain pass was relentless, the track barely wide enough for the vehicle. On his left, the sheer rock face scraped against the passenger window, a continuous, abrasive whisper. To his right, the perilous drop into a shrouded ravine seemed to swallow the light, an unnerving void. He felt a peculiar pressure behind his eyes, a dull ache that wasn't just from the altitude. Finally, the gradient eased. The driver, a man whose face was perpetually grimed, maneuvered the truck onto a gravel path that snaked through skeletal trees. The manor appeared abruptly, a hulking silhouette against the bruised sky. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from beneath heavy brows of overgrown ivy. Blake stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. The driver unloaded Blake's meager belongings, mostly crates of books and cartography tools, onto the crumbling porch. He accepted the final payment without a word, his gaze sweeping over the manor with an expression Blake couldn't quite decipher before turning the truck around. The vehicle's taillights, 2 receding crimson points, were the last sign of the outside world. He stood alone, the key heavy in his palm. Blake's voice, when he spoke, was a dry rasp. "All right, Blake, let's see what you've inherited." The initial days were a blur of methodical cataloging. Blake moved through the manor's cavernous rooms, each filled with the detritus of a forgotten life. He sorted through dusty ledgers, brittle photographs, and stacks of correspondence. The house felt less like a home and more like an archive, each object a fragment of a story he didn't yet understand. It was in the third-floor study, a room lined with shelves of obscure texts and smelling faintly of dried ink and beeswax, that he found it. Tucked beneath a pile of navigational charts, inside a slim, leather-bound portfolio, lay the map. It wasn't a standard topographical rendering. The parchment was thick, aged to a sepia tone, and felt strangely coarse beneath his fingers. Its edges were worn, almost frayed, as if handled countless times. Blake spread it across the vast oak desk carefully. It depicted the valley, yes, but with an unsettling specificity that went beyond geographical features. They looked like root systems or veins, spreading across the land, connecting points that seemed to have no logical relation. His cartographer's eye immediately registered the anomalies. Standard contour lines were absent in places, replaced by spirals and concentric circles. Text, scrawled in a faded, looping hand, annotated certain areas, but the language was an archaic script he couldn't immediately identify. He traced a finger along a particularly dense cluster of symbols that seemed to converge on the very spot where the manor stood. But the depiction of the house itself was bizarre. It wasn't a simple architectural footprint. Instead, it showed lines extending beyond the known walls, suggesting hidden wings, subterranean passages, and chambers that didn't appear on any structural plan he'd yet found. His gaze sharpened on a specific section of the manor's representation. Blake stood, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, the sound echoing in the silent room. He moved to the corner of the study where a heavy, built-in bookshelf stood. He ran his hand over the worn spines, then pressed against the solid oak panels behind them. Nothing. He returned to the map, studying the line, the eye. He looked down at the floorboards beneath his feet. He knelt, pressing his palms against the wood. Solid. Then he noticed it. A faint seam, almost imperceptible, where two planks met just beneath the bookshelf. It wasn't quite straight, curving slightly. He pressed harder, feeling for any give. There was a subtle shift, a barely audible creak that seemed to come from deep within the floor. He tried again, applying pressure to the seam. A faint, earthy scent, stronger than before, wafted up. It was the same smell he'd noticed outside, but intensified, richer, laced with something else he couldn't quite place. Something ancient and stagnant. He worked his fingers into the narrow gap, pushing, prying. The wood groaned, a deeper, more resonant sound this time. With a final, determined effort, the section of the floor gave way, tilting inward like a trapdoor. A rush of cold air, thick with that strange, compelling odor, spilled into the room. Below, a yawning blackness descended, the faint light from the window unable to penetrate its depths. This house, he realized, was not just a collection of rooms, but a series of forgotten spaces, and he had just found the first. The meticulous cataloging of the manor's contents had been Blake's anchor. He had moved through the dust-laden rooms with a cartographer's precision, mapping the chaos of inherited disarray. Ledgers, photographs, stacks of correspondence. Each item was a data point, an attempt to impose order on the encroaching entropy. It was this methodical approach that led him, inevitably, to the anomaly. Behind a loose panel in the study, concealed by decades of grime and a cleverly disguised hinge, he found not a hidden vault, but a small, empty alcove. Its walls were bare stone, cold and unyielding, yet the air within felt strangely still, almost held. It was a sensation more felt than heard, a vibration that settled deep behind his eyes. He stood there for a long moment, his hand still within the void, a prickle of unease tracing its way up his arm. The immediate aftermath was subtle. A moment of disorientation, perhaps. He found himself in the dining room, a half-sorted stack of antique silverware clutched in his hand, without a clear memory of having left the study. The manor was vast, and its silence was a heavy blanket that could easily muddle the passage of time. But the incidents grew. He would begin a task, only to find himself staring blankly at a wall minutes later. The purpose of his presence in that particular room entirely vanished. He started making lists, not just of inventory, but of his own daily intentions. Yet, even these lists occasionally seemed alien. A scrawled directive like, "Inspect West Wing attic," holding no immediate recognition, despite his own handwriting. The true erosion began with the past. He attempted to recall specific details of his late partner, a memory he cherished above all others. He focused on their first meeting, a rainy afternoon in a small, bustling cafe. He could picture the steam rising from their mugs, the way the light caught in their hair. But then, a flicker, a different setting. He saw not the cafe, but the manor's dusty library, the towering shelves, the scent of aged paper. His partner was there, smiling, but the context was wrong, utterly impossible. They had never set foot in this house together. A jolt, sharp and disorienting, went through him. He closed his eyes, forcing the cafe memory back, but the library lingered, a phantom photograph superimposed over the real one. He tried another memory, a vivid childhood camping trip. The crackle of the campfire, the distant howl of a coyote, the taste of burnt marshmallows. He could feel the rough canvas of the tent beneath his fingers. But then, the tent walls shifted, became the patterned wallpaper of the manor's guest bedroom. The scent of pine and smoke was replaced by the cloying sweetness of decaying potpourri. He remembered waking in that guest room, not the tent, with the faint, unsettling creak of the floorboards above. This new memory felt undeniably real, yet contradicted everything he knew. The insidious nature of it was terrifying. It wasn't just forgetting. It was replacing. A desperate need to ground himself took hold. He needed to recall the journey to this place, the most recent, undeniable anchor to his past. He pictured the dense forest giving way to craggy peaks, the sharp descent into the isolated basin. He focused on the narrow, treacherous turns of the mountain pass, the sheer drop-offs, the precise angle of the sun as he navigated the final stretch. But the images blurred. The mountain pass itself seemed to warp. The road, instead of asphalt, became a rough, uneven track that led directly into the manor's overgrown grounds. The peaks were not distant, but loomed immediately over the house, their stony faces indistinguishable from the manor's own crumbling facade. He remembered a sense of arriving, yes, but not the arduous drive, not the familiar landmarks he had passed. He remembered simply being here, as if he had always been here, as if the manor had materialized around him, or he within it. The memory of the journey, of his life, before the manor, was no longer his own. It was a mosaic of fragmented sensations, overlaid with details from the house itself. His breath hitched, a ragged sound in the cavernous room. The determination that had driven him to catalog, to impose order, now morphed into a desperate, frantic need to cling to what remained of himself. He was losing himself, piece by agonizing piece, and the house was the architect of his unraveling. Ledgers, photographs, stacks of correspondence. Each item was a data point, an attempt to impose order on the encroaching disquiet. But the disquiet had begun to seep through the meticulously ordered files, the perfectly aligned stacks. Fragments of faded ink, a recurring symbol in the margins of a diary, the unsettling lack of any record of the manor's earliest inhabitants. These had coalesced into an undeniable pressure. The silence of the house, once a comfort, had become a vacuum, pulling at the edges of his concentration. The manor, he now suspected, was not merely a house, but a crucible. He packed a small bag, his movements economical, a stark contrast to the growing agitation in his mind. The drive to the nearest settlement was a necessity, a forced extraction from the encroaching influence of the house. The winding dirt track that led away from the manor deteriorated quickly, becoming little more than a pair of ruts carved into the earth. The trees on either side pressed in, their branches interwoven, creating a perpetual twilight. Eventually, the track widened, merging with a gravel road that snaked upwards, leading through a narrow mountain pass. Blake noted the geological formations, the exposed strata of ancient rock, a professional habit that momentarily anchored him. He observed the absence of other cars, the lack of any human activity beyond the occasional weathered signpost. The town, when it finally appeared, was a skeletal arrangement of structures clinging to the side of a steep incline. Smoke curled from only 2 chimneys. The single main street was unpaved, dusted with fine gray grit. Wooden storefronts, some boarded up, others displaying faded, sun-bleached signs, lined the thoroughfare. No children played in the street. No voices carried on the thin breeze. A single dog, lean and wary, watched him from the porch of what appeared to be a general store. The quiet was absolute, a weight that settled in the chest. Blake parked his vehicle and stepped out. The crunch of his boots on the gravel sounded unnaturally loud. He adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, a gesture of reasserting control. The general store's bell jingled weakly as he pushed open the door. The interior was dim, smelling of dust, dried herbs, and old paper. Behind a counter, a woman, her face a roadmap of deep lines, looked up from a ledger. His eyes, the color of river stones, held a guarded, almost weary expression. "Looking for anything in particular?" he asked, his voice raspy as though unused. "Information," Blake replied, his voice betraying none of the internal tension. "I'm Blake. I've inherited the old Blackwood Manor further up the valley." A flicker, subtle and swift, crossed her face. His gaze dropped to him ledger, then back up to him, a new wariness in his eyes. "That place," he murmured, "been empty a long time." Blake purchased a few essentials, allowing the transaction to unfold slowly. He then inquired about local records, old maps, anything that might detail the valley's history. The woman directed him to a small, dusty room at the back of the town hall, overseen by an elderly clerk. The clerk, a gaunt man with spectacles perched on his nose, seemed equally reticent. Yet Blake's quiet persistence, his cartographer's precision in his questions, eventually yielded results. The man pointed to a shelf of oversized leather-bound books, their pages brittle with age. "Not much on that place, officially," the clerk stated, his voice low. "Folks don't like to talk about it." Or what came before. Blake pulled down the heaviest volume, its cover embossed with a faded, unidentifiable crest. He spent hours poring over the brittle pages, cross-referencing names and dates. The records were fragmented, incomplete. He found mention of the Blackwood family, certainly. Their lineage was rife with sudden disappearances, unexplained illnesses, premature deaths, often attributed vaguely to the valley's temperament or a wasting sickness. One entry, a scrawled notation in the margin of a property transfer, spoke of the Earth's hunger. Another, a diary entry from a long-dead local official, detailed the creeping forgetfulness that takes hold of those who linger too long in the valley's embrace. He discovered a pattern. Each owner of the manor, the family that occupied it, eventually faded from the historical record, their presence dissolving like mist. Their names might appear once, twice, then vanish, leaving behind only the property itself, awaiting the next inheritor. There were no detailed obituaries, no records of their departure, only a blank space followed by a new name on the deed. It was as if the valley itself consumed their stories, their very existence. And sometimes it remembers for them. He paused, adjusting his spectacles. Or rather, it ensures they forget, so it can remember. Blake's internal landscape shifted. The hungry earth was not a metaphor for poor harvests or difficult living. It was a literal consuming entity, not of flesh, but of memory, of identity. The previous inhabitants hadn't just died. They had been erased, their lives stripped bare until nothing remained but the empty shell of their dwelling. The manor was not just haunted, it was a participant. He had come seeking answers, and he had found lore. Lore that now resonated with a terrifying, undeniable truth. The drive back through the mountain pass felt different. The silence was no longer merely oppressive. It was watchful. Blake's understanding, forged in the chilling aftermath of his revelation, now settled into a grim, specific clarity. The manor was not merely a structure. It was the focal point, the primary ventricle for the parasitic intelligence that seeped from the earth. Its hunger was not for flesh or blood, but for the delicate lattice of memory, the very essence of identity. This knowledge, rather than paralyzing him, solidified a cold resolve. He would not be erased. The air in the drawing room where he now sat felt heavier than before, thick with the residue of forgotten lives. It was the house, breathing. Or perhaps, feeding. He spent the morning meticulously reviewing his maps, not of the manor itself, but of the surrounding valley. His cartographer's instinct demanded a physical understanding of the anomaly. The isolated valley, ringed by the skeletal peaks of the forgotten mountains, offered few points of egress. The primary route in and out, a winding, treacherous ascent, was the mountain pass. He marked it with a resolute pencil stroke, a narrow artery in a landscape that felt increasingly like a closed fist. It was subtle at first, a ghost of a scent, lavender and old paper. Blake paused, his hand hovering over an antique compass on his drafting table. He knew that smell. It was the exact, unique fragrance of his grandmother's study, a blend of her pressed flower sachets and the aging volumes she cherished. A tightness seized his chest, an involuntary contraction of grief. He knew, intellectually, that it was impossible. His grandmother had been gone for years. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the meticulous lines of his map. Yet, the scent intensified, becoming richer, sweeter, almost cloying. It was accompanied by a subtle shift in the room's temperature, a sudden, localized coolness that raised gooseflesh on his arms. Then, in the periphery of his vision, near the doorway leading to the conservatory, a flicker. It shimmered, indistinct, yet undeniably there. The air crackled, a barely audible static. The form solidified, or rather, coalesced. It was his grandmother, not as he was in life, but as a fragmented memory, a collage of moments. Her hair, a wispy halo of white, seemed to be made of spun moonlight. Her familiar floral dress hung on a frame that was too thin, too ethereal, almost transparent. The entity was not merely showing him an image. It was speaking directly to his sorrow. He squeezed his hands into fists, his nails biting into his palms. This was a trick, a lure. He understood its mechanism. "No," Blake said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You are not him." The apparition tilted its head, a motion that was too slow, too fluid, like an old film reel played at half speed. A faint, unsettling smile stretched across its translucent lips, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp. The entity was not just a devourer of memories. It was a mimic, a twisted echo, using his own grief as a weapon against him. It was trying to confuse his sense of reality, to blur the lines between what was real and what was a predatory illusion. It was a memory of a touch, twisted and made malevolent. He stood his ground, unwilling to retreat, unwilling to give the entity the satisfaction of his fear. The manifestation wavered, its edges fraying like old lace. It seemed to feed on his emotional response, growing slightly more defined with each surge of his internal turmoil. "You feed on my loss," Blake stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, a deliberate shield. "You twist it." The apparition's smile widened, a horrific, silent expansion of that empty maw. The lavender scent soured, becoming putrid, like decay. Blake felt his grip on reality fraying at the edges. The room seemed to undulate, the very air thick with malevolence. He closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing moment, then opened them. The entity was gone. The room was silent, save for the pervasive, low hum. Only the lingering, acrid scent of false lavender remained, a taunting reminder of the entity's power. The thought of escape flickered, then died. This was not a physical prison he could simply walk away from. The entity was inside him now, inside his memories, a parasitic intelligence that had found its way into the most vulnerable chambers of his mind. He had to fight it, not flee it. The swirling darkness receded, pulling back from Blake's vision as if a great, unseen hand had snatched the apparition away. He gasped, a ragged, wheezing sound, and stumbled backward, colliding with the heavy oak desk. The impact rattled the oil lamp, sending a tremor through the room, and for a heart-stopping moment, the flame dipped, threatening to plunge him into absolute blackness. He braced himself, his hands gripping the desk's edge until his knuckles blanched. The air, thick with the scent of dust and something acrid, felt impossibly heavy. His breath hitched, shallow and rapid, each inhalation a struggle against a phantom pressure on his chest. The image of that elongating, impossible form, the dissolving dress, the core of swirling void, was seared into his mind. This was real. This was the thing that had been preying on his thoughts, his memories, the very essence of his being. His gaze fell upon the rolled parchment lying discarded near his feet, the peculiar map he had discovered days ago, its lines and symbols a cryptic language he hadn't yet deciphered. He had dismissed it as an archaic architectural plan, perhaps a surveyor's folly. He picked up the map, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the faded ink. It wasn't just a blueprint of the manor's structure. The lines weren't merely walls and corridors. There were strange, almost organic patterns woven into the layout, concentrations of symbols in certain rooms, faint cross-hatchings that seemed to hum with an unseen energy. These weren't random occurrences. They corresponded. This map, he realized with a sickening certainty, was a diagram of the entity's influence. It depicted its feeding grounds within the manor, the areas where its tendrils reached deepest, where it drew sustenance from the very fabric of memory and grief. The concentrations of symbols marked the places of greatest drain, the lines indicating pathways of its insidious movement. It was a cartography not of stone and timber, but of metaphysical presence. He was a cartographer. He understood patterns, understood the language of lines and contours. If this map showed where the entity was, perhaps it could also show where it wasn't. Or, more importantly, how it operated. He might find a weakness, a way to contain it, to sever its connection to this place. This was a battle he understood, a problem he could attempt to solve, even if the stakes were his sanity, his very existence. He pulled himself back to the desk, pushing aside the books and scattered notes. He unrolled the ancient parchment, flattening it carefully. He retrieved his own drafting tools, his fine-tipped pens, his compass, his rulers. He began to work, meticulously comparing the found map to his own sketches of the manor's layout, cross-referencing areas where he had experienced the most profound unease or memory loss. As he drew, extending the lines, adding his own observations, a strange sensation began to creep over him. He focused, trying to ignore the creeping discomfort. He sketched the faint, almost invisible pathways he suspected the entity used, the subtle currents of its influence. He marked it with a small concentric circle, a symbol for drain. The air grew heavier, thick and still. The lamplight seemed to dim, though the wick burned steadily. He flinched, his pen scratching a harsh line across the parchment. He looked up, peering into the gloom, but saw nothing. As he tried to map the outer limits of the entity's reach, to understand how far its tendrils extended beyond the manor's immediate structure, a particular memory struggled to surface. It was of a drive with his mother years ago, through the winding, treacherous curves of the mountain pass that led into this isolated valley. But the details were hazy, the contours of the pass blurring, the memory of his mother's laugh, once so clear, now muffled, almost inaudible. It was as if the act of trying to recall it, to map it, was making it dissolve faster. A sharp, stabbing pain lanced through his temple. He cried out, dropping the pen. His head swam, and for a moment, the lines on the map seemed to shift and writhe, the ink pulsing with a faint internal light. It was a direct resistance, a counterattack. The entity was fighting back, feeding on his efforts, on the very memories he was trying to protect. He clutched his head, his vision blurring. He was losing himself. This wasn't just mentally taxing. It was dangerous, an act of defiance that the entity was actively punishing. But he couldn't stop. He had found a key, a way to understand. He just had to be strong enough to wield it. Gasping, he forced his trembling hand back to the map. He picked up his pen, his resolve hardened by the psychic assault. He would chart this parasite, trace its every insidious vein until he found its heart, even if it cost him everything. The oil lamp, a small beacon against the encroaching gloom, swayed precariously, casting elongated, dancing shadows that stretched and contracted like grasping fingers. He pushed himself away from the desk, his legs unsteady, the phantom image of the swirling void still burning behind his eyelids. The air, once merely stale, now carried a faint, cloying scent, like damp earth mixed with something metallic and old, a smell he couldn't quite place, yet found deeply unsettling. He needed to move, to escape the lingering presence of whatever had manifested. He turned, intending to retrace his steps to the grand hall, to the massive front doors that he had, in recent days, come to see as his only tenuous link to the outside. But the doorway he remembered, the one leading to the antechamber, was no longer there. It felt solid, permanent. This was not a trick of the light. Blake stumbled back, his breath catching. He spun around, searching for another exit, for any familiar landmark. A profound disorientation seized him. He had been in this room countless times, had meticulously charted its dimensions in his mind, yet now it warped, defied his internal compass. He forced himself to move, one deliberate step after another, his hand outstretched, tracing the unfamiliar contours of the wall. He pressed his palm against it, feeling a subtle vibration, a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from within the very structure of the manor. Was the house breathing? He dismissed the thought, a desperate attempt to cling to reason. A new passage materialized, a narrow, unlit corridor that hadn't existed moments before. It smelled of mildew and stale air, a scent that clawed at his sinuses. The corridor twisted and turned, each bend leading to another identical stretch of wall. But the numbers blurred, the directions merged. He passed a tarnished brass wall sconce, then another and another, each one identical, each one unlit. He swore he had seen this exact sconce moments ago on the previous turn, or was it the one before that? The repetition was a torment, a slow erosion of his sanity. He tried to recall the drive to the manor, the winding roads, the dense forest that had pressed in on either side. He pictured the specific curve of the mountain pass, the sheer drop-off to his left, the jagged peaks rising on his right, the way the late afternoon sun had glinted off the distant snowcaps. But then, the image wavered, like a poorly developed photograph. The peaks became indistinct, the forest a blur. Had the mountain pass truly existed? Had he truly driven through it? The memory, once vivid, now felt like something he had merely read about or dreamed. He found himself in a room that was vaguely familiar yet subtly wrong. It resembled the library, but the shelves were empty, dust-laden cobwebs hanging like tattered banners from the high ceiling. The heavy oak table, where he had spent hours poring over old maps, was gone, replaced by a single overturned wooden chair. He remembered the feel of the rough parchment under his fingertips, the faint smell of ink and aged paper. He remembered the specific sensation of tracing lines of longitude and latitude, the satisfaction of making order from chaos. But the memory felt thin, translucent, as if it were a borrowed experience, not his own. A low groan echoed from somewhere deep within the walls, a sound of immense, ancient timbers shifting under an unseen force. The floor beneath his feet vibrated, a deep, unsettling rumble that made his teeth clatter. A section of the wall to his left, previously solid, now receded with a grating sound, revealing a narrow, claustrophobic gap. Blake swallowed, his throat dry and constricted. This was no longer just an old house with secrets. It was a living, malevolent entity, actively fighting him, trying to break him down piece by piece. His memories, his very sense of self, were dissolving. He clutched his head, a wave of profound disorientation washing over him. Who was he? If not a man who had charted the world, a man who had driven through a specific mountain pass to reach this place. If the memories of his life before this manor were fading, then had he ever existed outside these walls? Was this all there had ever been? Despite the encroaching despair, a flicker of his innate cartographer stubbornness remained. He would find the logic, the pattern, even in this chaos. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the metallic scent filling his lungs, and peered into the newly opened chasm. He pushed the last meticulously drawn segment of the manor's sublevel onto the desk, its edges aligning with the larger composite map. The oil lamp, still trembling slightly, cast a warm, sickly glow over the parchment, illuminating the intricate web of lines Blake had spent weeks charting. His fingers, stained with graphite and smudged with ink, hovered over the surface. Blake's determination, a cold, steady flame within him, sharpened his focus. He leaned closer, his eyes tracing the familiar contours of the foundations, the known cellars, the forgotten wine stores. His cartographic training, rigorous and precise, demanded an explanation for every anomaly, every deviation from logical structure. He had cross-referenced his own measurements with the few decaying blueprints he had unearthed, comparing the known, the suspected, and the utterly absent. There it was. Not a line, but a lack of one. A section of the oldest foundation, beneath what would have been the original hearth of the manor, registered as an impossibly dense, unmapped void. His instruments, usually reliable, had either given erratic readings or simply failed to penetrate this specific area. It was an absence that spoke volumes, a blank space on a map that should have been filled with stone, earth, or bedrock. It was a pocket of non-existence, a structural impossibility. He pulled a magnifying glass from a leather pouch, its brass rim cool against his fingers. This wasn't merely a hidden room. It was a space deliberately concealed, a place actively resisting documentation. The house, he realized, wasn't just hiding something. It was protecting it. The journey from the study to the suspected entrance felt like a descent into an internal cavity of the house. He found the access point in the deepest part of the secondary cellar, behind a false wall constructed of rough-hewn stones, expertly mortared to blend seamlessly with the older masonry. It took considerable effort to pry the stones loose, the sound of scraping rock grating against the stillness, each movement an act of deliberate intrusion. The air within it was heavy, suffocating, yet it seemed to pull at him. A subtle, almost imperceptible suction. Blake descended, his boots finding purchase on crude, hand-carved steps that spiraled downwards into the earth. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing in on his chest, making each breath a conscious effort. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a chamber. It was vast, far larger than he had anticipated, carved directly from the bedrock, its ceiling lost in the gloom beyond the reach of his lantern. The walls were uneven, rough, adorned with no carvings, no markings, nothing to indicate human presence save for the crude steps he had used. This was it. The heart. The chamber pulsed with an invisible, suffocating weight. It was a nexus, Blake realized, not of energy or power in any conventional sense, but of absence. He felt it then, a subtle, insidious draining. Memories, sharp and clear only moments before, now felt distant, hazy, their edges blurring. He thought of his sister, her laughter, her face, and for a terrifying second, the details wavered, threatening to dissolve into an indistinct blur. The air itself seemed to hum with the echoes of forgotten lives, of joys unremembered, of sorrows that had nowhere else to go but into this consuming maw. Blake stood at the precipice of oblivion, a lone figure in a space that hungered for everything he was, everything he had ever been. His fingers, trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and a nascent dread, completed the last stroke. The oil lamp, its flame now sputtering and weak, cast a final sickly glow over the parchment. Blake leaned back, the creak of the old chair a sharp punctuation in the oppressive silence. The intricate web of tunnels, forgotten passages, and subterranean chambers he had spent weeks charting led, undeniably, to a central point. Not a room, not a vault, but a nexus. An empty space, yet profoundly significant, depicted by a single featureless circle at the map's heart. It was the eye of the storm, the origin point of the creeping psychic decay that had been slowly devouring his memories, his grief, his very identity. He had charted the path to oblivion, and now he had to walk it. Blake secured the lamp, its light barely a pinprick against the encroaching gloom, and began his descent. The passages narrowed, the ceiling lowering until he was forced to hunch, his breath rasping in the confined space. As he ventured deeper, the subtle hum that had permeated the manor's upper levels intensified, growing into a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very bones of the earth. It was a sound Blake now recognized as the entity's voice, a wordless, insidious song of yearning and consumption. The pressure in his skull mounted, a dull ache blossoming into a sharp, insistent pain behind his eyes. Images flickered at the periphery of his vision. Faces he almost recognized, places that felt familiar but lacked definition. He saw a child's swing set, empty and swaying in a phantom breeze. A hand, reaching out, then dissolving into mist. These were not his memories, not entirely. They were fragments, ghosts of what the entity had consumed, now offered back to him, distorted and incomplete. A psychic lure. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus on the rough-hewn path ahead, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the encroaching mental fog. The passageway opened into a vast, cavernous space, a natural chamber carved deep within the earth, far beneath the manor's foundations. The air here was utterly still, heavy and thick, as if time itself had ceased to flow. A place where the light seemed to bend, where the air shimmered with an unnatural distortion. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic beat that echoed the thrumming in his head. This was it, the core. Here, the entity's presence was absolute. It was not a physical being, but a consciousness, vast and ancient, woven into the very fabric of the earth beneath the manor. It was a parasitic intelligence that did not merely feed on memory and grief. It was the collective, tormented echo of all memory and grief that had ever been felt within this valley, distilled into a singular, ravenous hunger. A voice, not of sound but of pure thought, entered Blake's mind. It was soft, seductive, promising an end to all pain. It was the voice of oblivion, cloaked in the guise of solace. Let go. The burdens you carry are heavy. Here there is peace. Here your lost ones await, whole and without sorrow. Blake saw him then, his lost loved one, standing in a sun-drenched field of wildflowers. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of the joy he remembered. He felt the phantom touch of her hand, warm and comforting. He remembered her laughter echoing between the ancient stones, a sound so pure it could mend any wound. Then the vision shifted. The wildflowers withered, the sun dimmed. The laughter on the mountain pass became a mournful wail, distorted, echoing with the agony of loss. The entity was not offering to return his memories. It was offering to absorb them, to take his pain and his joy and make them its own, in exchange for his complete erasure. The peace it offered was the peace of non-existence. The reunion a cruel psychic illusion designed to lull him into surrender. He felt the tendrils of its consciousness probing, seeking weaknesses. searching for the deepest fissures of his sorrow to exploit. It presented his greatest regrets, his lingering guilt, like poisoned offerings, promising to wipe them clean, to make them unhappen. His mind reeled under the assault, a cacophony of distorted images and phantom sensations. But in the midst of the psychic storm, a single clear thought pierced through the haze. This is not real. This was not solace. It was theft. This was not reunion. It was a trap. To surrender was to betray every cherished memory, every painful lesson learned, every piece of himself that had ever existed. Blake squeezed his eyes shut, his hands clenching into fists. The battle was not one of strength, but of will. He had come here to confront the entity, not to join it. His memories, even the painful ones, were his. They were the scars that made him who he was. He opened his eyes, the phosphorescent glow of the cavern seeming to intensify, the thrumming in his head reaching a fever pitch. He would fight. He would remember. The true confrontation had only just begun. Blake saw him then, his lost loved one, standing in a sun-drenched field of wildflowers. It was a memory so perfect, so utterly real, it threatened to dissolve the crumbling walls of the manor around him. He could almost feel the vibration of the old truck's engine beneath his hand, the sun hot on his face. This was it, the lure, the final irresistible offering. But something was wrong. The air in the memory was too clean, the light too bright. The scent of pine was sharp, but lacked the underlying dampness of true mountain air. His cartographer's mind, honed by years of mapping subtle discrepancies, noted the precise, almost mathematical symmetry of the peaks, a perfection that nature rarely allowed. A cold thread of dread began to weave through the warmth of the illusion. This wasn't a memory. It was a distillation, a pristine, deadly trap. He stood in the manor's central hall, the damp stone chilling his bare feet through the thin fabric of his trousers. The air here was heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and ancient, like old blood seeped into the very foundation. The vision of the mountain pass shimmered, threatening to pull him in fully, to replace the reality of the peeling wallpaper and the dust motes dancing in the meager light. He clenched his jaw, determined. His gaze snapped to the large, scarred table where the map lay spread. It was almost complete. Every corridor, every hidden room, every shift in the manor's impossible architecture had been meticulously charted. It was an anomaly, a place that refused to be mapped, a negative space that pulsed with an unseen energy. The vision of the mountain pass began to distort, the vibrant wildflowers turning to a sickly purple, his loved one's smile stretching, her eyes becoming vast, empty pools. He saw himself in the vision, walking hand in hand, but his own face was growing indistinct, blurring at the edges, his features fading like a poorly rendered photograph. The parasitic intelligence was not just feeding on the memory, it was consuming him within it. Blake stumbled toward the table, his hand reaching for the charcoal stick. The air grew thick, pressing in on him. Utterly, irrevocably erased. The map would be complete, and he would be the final, unwitting sacrifice. He gripped the charcoal, his knuckles white. The vision of the mountain pass flickered, the peaks now resembling gaping mouths, the sky a swirling vortex of indistinct colors. His mind raced, desperate for a solution. The map was a record, yes, but it was also a framework, a representation of the entity's domain. What if the final mark wasn't a memory, but an absence? A negation? With a guttural cry that tore from his throat, Blake brought the charcoal down. He didn't draw a room, didn't trace a memory. Instead, he drew a stark, jagged line, a fissure, ripping through the blank space at the map's core. It wasn't a symbol of a place, but a symbol of severance, of rupture, He was mapping the unmappable, denying the entity its final personal anchor. A shriek, not of wind, but of raw, ancient agony ripped through the manor. The walls groaned, dust raining down in thick clouds. The floorboards beneath his feet bucked, and the entire structure seemed to tilt, as if a colossal hand had seized it. Blake felt a violent wrenching in his mind, as if an invisible hook had been torn from his very soul. A vast, echoing emptiness settled in his chest, a hole where a lifetime of memories should have resided. He remembered a woman, her face a blur of warmth and kindness, but her name, her laughter, the specifics of their life together. They were gone, consumed, leaving only the ghost of a feeling. The pain was immense, a phantom limb of the soul. He had denied the entity its full meal, but the price was steep. He had severed its power, but it had taken its pound of flesh. The tremors ceased. The air, though still thick with decay, no longer pulsed with the predatory hunger. The manor felt dormant, not dead, but sleeping, its monstrous intelligence temporarily starved, its tendrils withdrawn. Blake stood, gasping, leaning heavily on the table, the charcoal stick still clutched in his hand. He looked down at the map, now complete. He had survived, yes, only as a fragment, a shadow of the man he once was, forever haunted by the memories he no longer possessed. The map that would linger, a silent sentinel, for the next soul brave or foolish enough to seek solace in the manor's forgotten embrace.